So our chapter here, as you see, is called Making Ethical Decisions and Managing a Socially Responsible Business. By the way, if you are a business major, once you transfer to a four-year university, if you're going for a bachelor's degree, you'll probably be taking a business ethics course as part of your program. And I've taught that before at different institutions. We don't offer business ethics here at Hartnell currently, but I think it's a fascinating topic. And hopefully as we go through this chapter, you agree that we're just touching the surface here today, but it's something you can really dig deeply into and give a lot of thought to. So why do I think ethics is so interesting? Well, your ethical beliefs really are based on whatever your philosophical beliefs are. And you might not think of yourself as having a philosophy. Maybe you've never studied philosophy, but we all have a philosophy. We all have a way of looking at the world that's based on our beliefs, our values, our upbringing. And that philosophy that we have influences our view of ethics. Now, what is ethics? Ethics, in my opinion, is fairness. So I would look at it this way. Morality, okay, think of morality as a big topic, okay? Morality is good versus bad. And each of us has to decide, what does it mean to be good versus to be bad or evil, right? That's a personal decision. But ethics is part of morality. It's the part of morality that says what is good or bad in how we treat each other. Are we being fair, which would be good, or unfair, which would be bad, right? There are some ethical perspectives that say it's okay to be evil, believe it or not. I don't subscribe to that ethical perspective. But it is a personal decision. So again, I would just suggest we think of ethics as fairness. So then if morality is good versus bad, and ethics is fairness, business ethics is what does it mean to be fair in a business situation? What does it mean to be fair to a customer, to a coworker, to an employee, right? Those are examples of business ethics, which ties into this concept of corporate social responsibility. Sometimes you'll just see that abbreviated as CSR. And what that means is a corporation being responsible to society? You remember on day one, I talked about how corporations are sometimes like a human being. Remember that conversation? That we are systems that turn inputs into our talents. Corporations, they take inputs and they turn them into products and services. Well, these corporations don't just exist in nature. They exist because society allows them to exist. So if these corporations are not being responsible to society, then we need to hold them accountable, right? So that's what this idea of corporate social responsibility is. Our corporations, which is a specific type of business, are those corporations being fair and how they treat different groups. So we'll get into more detail on that. We'll talk about the different stakeholder groups. I think that word has come up before. Who can tell me what a stakeholder is? What is meant by that term? Person that holds shares in the company. Okay, so somebody that owns shares of stock would be a stakeholder. Now that this gets a little confusing. You're right, Andrew. You can call that person, that investor, a shareholder. You could also call them a stakeholder. Okay, both of those are, or I meant to say stockholder. See, even I got confused. So you can call the investor a shareholder because they own shares of stock. You can call them a stockholder because they own shares of stock, but they are a type of stakeholder. But there are other stakeholders that are not investors. Have we talked about this at all? No, maybe not. Okay. So actually we did, but it was on day one. I talked about stakeholder theory. Stakeholder theory says that corporations should make a profit, but they should also pay attention to the needs of their employees, the needs of their customers, the needs of the community. All these different groups are called stakeholders because they have a stake in the company. Not necessarily a financial stake, but some interest in the company. Okay, let me give you an example. If a corporation goes out of business, the employees lose their jobs. The customers no longer get their product or service. The company is no longer paying taxes because it's out of business. The banks that made loans to the company might not get their money back. The suppliers that used to sell to the company can't sell to the company anymore. So all of these different groups have a stake in that company. Okay? So when I use the term stakeholder, it's all of those groups. It's not just the investors. It's everybody that has an interest in the company. So we'll talk about how corporations can be responsible to all of those different stakeholder groups. And then a little bit about trends related to ethics. Okay, so a lot to cover here. Any questions at this point? Any comments? All right. Okay, now this is not in the textbook, but I felt it was really important to address. There was this researcher, Kohlberg, who came up with this 6 stages of moral reasoning. What he said is when we act morally, when we do what's good instead of what's bad, there are different reasons that we might do that. And basically, as we mature in our lives, our ability to reason and be moral evolves. So if you think about a toddler, they're at this basic level here. They might understand punishment, like being put in a timeout, or reward, like you'll get a cookie if you do the right thing. But they don't really understand morality beyond that, right? So if you're dealing with somebody that young, just 2 or 3 years old, you kind of have to either bribe them to get them to do the right thing, or maybe even, slight punishment like a timeout. I would not advocate anything, hitting a child or anything. I think that would be immoral. But some slight punishment might be necessary because that's what the child will understand. And it's only as they get a little older, maybe get into school, that they could start to understand, oh, well, there are rules that I'm supposed to follow. And because we all follow the rules, things go better. But when somebody doesn't follow the rules, it creates a problem. So you start to understand morality from a higher level. And then as we become adults, you become even more mature and you can say, oh, well, yeah, I don't want to live in a society where everybody's breaking the law all the time. That would be chaos, right? So our moral reasoning continues to evolve, and to the point where, as it says, morality is based on principles that transcend mutual benefit. It's not just doing the right thing because I'll get something good in return or because I don't want to go to jail. It's doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, right? And that represents a pretty high stage of moral reasoning. So we can think about that as we think about ethics and making these decisions. Imagine you've worked hard to start your own business. You invested thousands of dollars, weeks, months, years worth of work. and your business is struggling and you think, you know what, I could cheat a little bit and it would help. It would make my business more successful. But a little voice inside of you saying, yeah, but might get caught. That's the fear of punishment. Not only that, that's not who you are. You're not a cheater. You're not a liar, a thief. You need to act morally, right? And it's difficult sometimes in business, especially if you've got lots of money at stake. It's really easy to try to rationalize things and not be moral, not be ethical. So by studying ethics, can really evaluate what our own beliefs are about what's good and what's bad, what's fair and what's unfair. And then when we're confronted with these ethical dilemmas, it's easier to make the right decision because we've already thought it through. Any questions so far? Any comments? So where do our ethics come from? I mentioned that we all have a philosophy, we all have our view of morality, even if we've never thought about it before. And those guide our ethical perspectives. So in the workplace, it is influenced by the culture of the organization. I've noticed here at Hardnell, it's one of the things I love about being here. Most people will hold the door open for somebody they don't know because that person's coming in behind them. That's a little thing. But they're giving up maybe a second of their time, a little bit of their energy to be polite to that other person. Now, that's part of the culture that I found at this college. So that's an example of how in an organization, like in a business, if there's a culture, sometimes there are some specific rules, and these things create, an environment that can be positive for everybody involved, or in some cases, negative. Jake?
Could it be like a regional thing too?
Yeah.
I've went to like certain places and kind of noticed that. I mean, there's a lot of places in California where people are really nice, but it seems like California, a lot of people are kind of like head down, And then I found some other places where you usually walking down the street and someone's gonna smile at you, and look in your eyes, and it's just like it feels a lot better.
Exactly. So the culture, the overall environment, all of these influence our ethics and how we interact with one another. For example, New Yorkers, they're in a hurry, typically. They're all out on the street, they're crowded in subways, and that influences how they interact with each other. Here in California, we're driving in our cars, it's a different experience, honking at each other maybe on the freeway. So yeah, regional differences certainly come into play. Okay, so our ethics are influenced by our philosophy, our morality, our values, and the environment that we're in. Now, there are some different ethical belief systems, and we don't have time to really get into them, but I will present two competing ethical perspectives. And the first one is called utilitarianism. Fancy name, right? Utilitarianism. It's been around for hundreds of years. And the basic premise is that the ethical thing is whatever provides the greatest good to the greatest number of people. Okay? Who can tell me the root word utility, which is the basis of utilitarianism? What does utility mean? Are you familiar with that? Like a utility knife? It means useful. Okay? Utilitarianism, think of it as a useful way to look at ethics, is that whatever provides the greatest good to the greatest number of people, that is the right thing. And our country here is based on democratic principles where the majority gets to decide, right? We get to vote for president and other politicians, and sometimes we get to vote on certain laws. So the majority gets to decide whatever is good for the greatest number is usually what we do in this society. So that it's really based on a utilitarian principle. But we also have individual rights. And sometimes there's a conflict. So let me give you an example of that. Okay, this is just a classic example that I think illustrates this concept. Let's imagine that you own a house that's been in your family for generations. Got passed down from your grandparents to your parents to you. And you love this house, you grew up there, you live there, and it has a lot of sentimental value to you, okay? And then you get a letter one day saying that the state of California has decided that a freeway needs to go through where your house is. Because that freeway is going to provide a benefit to the community. It's going to let people travel more quickly. It's going to create some economic prosperity in the region. So the greatest good for the greatest number of people is going to be this freeway. Is that ethical? If you are not wanting to give up your house. Now, in that situation, does anybody know what it's called when a government can take your property and use it for the benefit of the masses?
Mhm.
They have to pay you for it. But does anybody know what that's called?
I don't know in Spanish, pero I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Expropriation.
What is it in Spanish?
Expropiación.
Okay, like appropriation,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah, so in English, we say eminent domain. It gives government the power to take, well, to buy your property when it benefits the society. And you don't have a choice in that matter. So you could argue from a utilitarian standpoint that this is fair because it provides the greatest good to the greatest number of people. But you could also argue from an individual rights perspective that you should not be forced to give up your home that you love, even if the government's going to pay you for it. It shouldn't be forced upon you, right? So you can see these two different ethical perspectives and how they might conflict.
Is it legal to do, I think they did it in SpongeBob where they just built like a bridge right over someone's house or pressing grams. Did you do that? Like,
Yeah.
build right over.
Yeah, under eminent domain, if it's determined that this is better for the community at large, then yes, it gives governments that power. Now, can somebody fight it legally? Yes, because it really means there are certain rights we have as individuals, right? And it's also sort of a judgment call. Who says it's better for the and can we really prove that this is the better thing to do for the largest group of people?
Could the business still stay open if it was like under a
Maybe or maybe not. Yeah, there might then violate some zoning laws, or there might be some safety issues, so it's very complicated, right? And so that's why we often get into these legal battles in our court system. Christina, I saw your hand go up. Let's say it again. I did, okay, all right. Any other questions or comments? So the point here is that depending on your ethical perspective, you might see things one way and somebody else sees it a different way. Now, if there is a legal dispute, then we go to the courts. And a judge or jury is going to hear both sides and make a decision. When there's an ethical dispute, who's the authority? Who can say what's right, what's wrong, what's moral, what's immoral? There is no universally recognized authority. If you're, let's say you're Catholic, you might look to the Pope and say, okay, well, the Pope decides what's moral, what's immoral. If you're a Muslim, maybe you look at what the Imam says. But there's no universally recognized ethical authority for the entire country. So ethics is really an individual decision, which is why it's based on your personal values and philosophies. Now, in the workplace, sometimes you'll see unethical things going on. Your boss or your coworkers might be doing things that you feel are not right. They might even be pressuring you to do the same thing. If you ever find yourself in that environment, I would encourage you consider whether this is really the company you should be working for, right? If your values don't align with theirs, maybe you need to find a better opportunity. Quick example. I showed you that one of the videos is about WorldCom and the multi-billion-dollar fraud. One of their accountants knew that the company was committing fraud. And in fact, she was helping because her boss told her to. And she felt really bad about it. Her name was Betty Vincent. And eventually she went to the authorities. I think it was the FBI, and she said, hey, there's some fraud going on. Well, it turns out the authorities already knew about it. They were already investigating. And so she was not the first person to blow the whistle. But she had been complicit. Even though she blew the whistle, she had been participating in the fraud. And when everything came down, she ended up doing some jail time. They let her off a little bit easy because she did blow the whistle, but again, she wasn't the first one. She should have never done, unethical things in the first place. And if she felt that she was being forced to, she should have gone to the authorities immediately, right? But her hesitation ended up causing her to do some jail time. All right, let's see. Let's cover these two slides and then I'll show you that video. So as I mentioned, the environment that we're in influences our ethical behavior. The company and how it acts, what it believes, influences how you're going to act. And really the executives, the top management, they set the example. So if they're being unethical, that kind of says to everybody else that you can be unethical, right? So it's really important for the executives to set a good, example for everybody else and to be ethical. One way they can do that, the company can develop a code of ethics where they actually document what they believe is ethical so that you as an employee can read it. And if you come across a situation and you're not sure what's the right thing to do here, you can look back to the code of ethics and it'll tell you, oh, in this situation, you do this. Like if a customer brings back a product that's defective, it might say that, we give them their money back, no questions asked. Or it might say, as long as it's within 90 days, we think it's ethical to give them their money back. Or as long as it's within 90 days and they have a receipt. So the company defines what it feels is fair in the code of ethics. And if they don't get down to the very specific details, at least they can say, these are the values that you should base your decisions on. Like, we believe in customer service. We believe in honesty. And by putting those values out there as an organization, you're telling your employees how to base their ethical decisions. So these are things that the company can do to create an ethical culture. Now, the textbook tells us there are these 4 levels of social responsibility, of how a company can be responsible to society, specifically a corporation. Okay, this applies to all companies, but let's talk just about corporations. And the reason corporations are different is because they do have a responsibility to make a profit for their investors, right? So how do you balance that responsibility to make a profit with the responsibility of being ethical? Those often compete. So the textbook tells us there are 4 levels of responsibilities, and I don't completely agree with this, and I'll tell you why. According to the textbook, the most basic responsibility of a corporation is to make enough money to stay in business. Because obviously, if it runs out of money and goes out of business, then it's no good to anybody, right? So it needs to make enough money to go into business, which would mean making a profit, which means then you're able to reward your investors from the profits. And it also says that there's an expectation that corporations follow the law. That would be the second level of responsibility, to follow the law. And I think we can all agree that that's important. And then the third level would be to act ethically, to make sure you're being fair to your different stakeholder groups. Now, this is where I disagree. I think if a company is making a profit and following the law, but they're not being ethical, then there's a problem. Their fundamental business model is wrong if they're not being ethical, in my opinion. So I would say that these 3 responsibilities are equally important. You need to be ethical, legal, and profitable. Now, there is a 4th level of social responsibility, philanthropic. What's meant by philanthropic? All these fancy words. What's philanthropy? Anybody? Basically, giving to charity. Okay? So yeah, when a corporation donates money or they give some of their time or their products to help some other organization, that's philanthropy. And that's great. That's really a nice thing to do. But it's not a requirement. Corporations don't have to do that, right? It's kind of like icing on the cake if they do that. All right. We've covered a lot. Sorry, I do get kind of excited about this topic, Sorry if I'm talking too much, but I think it's so fascinating to dig into and really think about what does it mean to be ethical. Okay, so let's pause there for a little bit. I'm going to show you this video about the ethics of artificial intelligence. Anybody have questions while I'm pulling that up here? Okay. So here's an interesting question. An example of legal but irresponsible behavior. What's legal, as I said earlier, is determined by the courts. What's ethical is decided by each of us. What would be an example of a situation that's legal but you feel is unethical? Anybody have any examples that come to mind? No?
In some cases, tax cuts.
Tax cuts, okay. Good example. So tell us why. What do you feel? Obviously, if there are tax cuts, it's our legislators that are cutting taxes because they have that power. So it's legal. Why would it be unethical?
Also, people are getting out of the moral obligations.
Some people are then getting out of their moral obligation to pay taxes. Now, we can argue all day about how much we should be taxed and what that tax money should go towards, right? But you could definitely view it as unfair if you feel that some people are getting tax breaks that they don't deserve, right? We give tax breaks to multi-billion-dollar corporations. We give tax breaks to billionaire individuals. Why do they need the tax breaks? I think we need the tax breaks, right? The ones who are not billionaires. So yes, that's a perfect example. Anything else come to mind where something might be legal but unethical? Or you can flip it around. Is there a situation that might be ethical but illegal? So there are many, many things we could look at for examples on this. But one I'm going to go with, because a lot of people I find are just not even aware of this. is the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling. Has anybody heard of that? Citizens United. Okay, this is one of the most important legal developments of our lifetimes. There was a case that came before the Supreme Court, this was more than a decade ago, where there was a question about how much money rich people and corporations can give to influence politics. Okay, that was the basic question there. And our Supreme Court said that corporations are persons. And I've told you that there are similarities between corporations and people, but they said under the law, a corporation is a legal person. And it has the right to free speech, like we do here in America. If you're a citizen, you have the right to say whatever you want to say, with some exceptions, but it's for the most part. But they also said that speech is money. That giving money to a political campaign is a form of speech. So according to our Supreme Court of the United States, corporations can give as much money as they want to political campaigns. There's a certain mechanism by which they have to do that, but they can give unlimited amounts of money to influence politics, and it's perfectly legal. No wonder our political system is such a mess. We have corporations and billionaires buying off politicians. Even a member of the Supreme Court, if you've been following the news, there have been all these revelations about Justice Clarence Thomas, who I think has been serving on the Supreme Court longer than anybody else on the Supreme Court. He's been taking bribes for years and not being held accountable. In fact, our Supreme Court of the United States does not have an ethical code that is enforced. All the other federal judges have to follow very strict laws. But our Supreme Court says, we don't have to. We're the Supreme Court. We don't have to hold ourselves to ethical standards.
Even though like it's not, I guess, as corrupt as some places, it's kind of critical to point out corruption in other countries, and we have like stuff like this happening, even though it's
Yeah, we do have corruption in our government system, unfortunately. I would say studies I've seen of how much corruption we have versus other countries, we're not at the top of the list, we're not at the bottom of the list, you know. We're probably less corrupt than the average country out there, but there is a lot of corruption in our political system, for sure, and we need to fix it. And a lot of it has been exposed in recent years. And a lot of it goes back to this issue of unlimited money being dumped on both of the major political parties. It's not one or the other, it's both. And it's something we need to fix. And there are ways to fix it. But when the people that need to fix it are the ones getting the money, well, we need to hold them accountable, right? That's why we all need to vote. We all need to be educated about what's going on and voice our opinion by voting. So good point. Did I miss anybody else? Did anyone else have a comment or question? So again, if you've never heard of the Citizens United case, check it out. You know, pull up an article about it. I think you'll find it pretty interesting because it is an example of something that's legal, giving unlimited money to a political campaign. I think most people would agree it's not very ethical because we as individuals then have less influence. We don't have billions of dollars to give to politicians, but corporations and billionaires do. Okay, so we'll cover this slide and then we'll do our video discussion. We've talked about how corporations have responsibilities to society, right? Let's think specifically about the responsibilities to their customers. What can a corporation do to be responsible to their customers? What do you think?
Ensure that they are getting quality.
Okay. Give them a quality product, quality service that's not going to harm them, right? Make sure the products themselves are not dangerous. Not advertise things like tobacco to children, right? Because doing so would be irresponsible. Corporations should listen to their customers, charge them a reasonable price, not gouge them. These are some of the things companies can do to be fair to their customers. Okay. I brought this up the first day of class. When I talked about paradigms, I told you there are two competing ways to look at the role of a corporation. One approach is to say corporations should make as much profit as they can as long as they follow the law. And I explained to you that's part of the neoliberal economic philosophy brought to us by Milton Friedman here and Hayek, who was an Austrian economist. So according to these gentlemen, who are brilliant economists, I mean, they are some of the top economists ever, but they have this view, that that's the role of the corporation. Make as much profit as you can, as long as you follow the law. Because by doing that, by making that profit, you reward your investors and you pay lots of taxes in theory, although a lot of corporations don't. You enrich your investors, you pay taxes, you create jobs, you provide products and services. So that's why corporations should really make as much profit as they can. It sounds like a rational argument, but I think where it falls apart is that if companies are paying off politicians to write the laws, then they end up following laws that they created. So the laws don't really restrain the corporations. The laws let them get away with all kinds of things that they really shouldn't get away with. So I think just expecting them to follow the law is not enough. We need to fix it so that they can't influence the laws. And literally, there are conferences, you can look this up too, it's called ALEC. I forgot exactly what it stands for, but it's this organization that has these conferences. Companies come to the conference to meet with politicians, and they bring laws that they wrote. The corporations wrote the laws, and they say, here, politician, we'd like for you to pass this law for us. And by the way, we just made a contribution to your campaign. We have corporations actually writing the laws that in some cases go into effect. So that's where it's flawed. I think this viewpoint leaves this big loophole that allows corporations to create the laws and make ungodly amounts of money that benefit them and benefit their investors, but hurt society as a whole. So I subscribe to stakeholder theory, which says that corporations should not only make a profit, but they should also pay attention to the needs of their customers, the needs of their employees, the needs of the community, etc., all the different stakeholder groups. And interestingly, stakeholder theory argued that corporations are more profitable when they do that over time. That if they're fair to everybody, they're actually going to end up making more money. Now, that's a little bit hard to prove, but whether that's true or not, I think as society, we need to hold corporations accountable and make sure they're not being unethical by our standards, by society standards, right? We should not allow, and this is happening today in our country. There are meat packing facilities employing minors. That's illegal, but they're doing it anyways. There are plenty of companies that are employing people and not giving them workers' compensation insurance. So that person gets hurt on the job and they don't have any medical coverage. I could go on. There are many problems, but I think a lot of it boils down to these two competing views. Role of the corporation just to make a profit, or is it to consider all the different stakeholder needs? All right, does anyone have questions or comments? Okay. All right, well, let's take 8 minutes then. 8 minutes, and get into your groups and come up with your group questions. Resume.
Just write it down.
Write down.
Okay, hang in there with me, everybody, for a moment. So a couple quick points. I mentioned that sometimes companies give money to charity. They act philanthropically. And sometimes by doing that, there's a strategic benefit. Not only are they doing something good, they're also helping raise public awareness of their company. They might end up getting more customers or more employees by doing that. So sometimes doing good actually comes back and benefits the company. Something we all have to think about is, how do we make sure we have good jobs in the future, right? Especially if robots and AI are getting so advanced. What can we do as individuals? Oh, sorry, we're tired. What can we do as individuals that cannot be replaced by robots and AI? Right? That should be an important question we all think about in our careers. We also have to think about corporations that operate in multiple countries, because ethical values differ, as we said, based on your environment. So what's considered ethical in one country might not be ethical in another country, right? So if you're operating in multiple countries, you have to think about that. Okay, let's do our quick matching activity. I'm just going to walk us through it, okay? Because I'm sorry I didn't leave us enough time. We each have to make our own ethical decisions, right? So we've got that voice that's telling us to do the wrong thing and another voice telling us to do the right thing. We need to try to listen to the right one. Companies have to make a decision. Do we do what's good for humanity and the environment, or do we do what's going to make us the most money? Corporate social responsibility relates to morals, it relates to ethics, all of that you can see in this word cloud. We see some of the different stakeholder groups that a company has to think about and try to make sure it's being fair and ethical too. And then lastly, we've seen some trends. For example, I know it's hard to see them right now, but Colin Kaepernick took a stand for what he believed was morally right? And whether you agree with him or not, he put his values ahead of his career. And it cost him a lot in terms of his career, but he did what he believed was right, okay? All right, that's all we have time for. See you all Thursday.